All right, gang, let's say you've got your initial configuration done. You've run through the Express setup or you ran through the setup wizard, and now you've got the ability to access the device. You'd like to set up the wireless configuration now for the wireless LAN controller element of your Catalyst 3850, 3650, or 5760 wireless LAN controller. So what's going to happen next? Well, now through a network port, you can certainly connect in and then be able to access a front-end website, a GUI interface. Woohoo! Again, you can see you simply put in HTTP or HTTPS and the IP address that you've set up for that device. Now, in this example, we happen to be seeing 10.0.0.1 as the IP address, but don't be confused with the Express setup. It happens to be the same because we set it to be the same. It's whatever you've configured for the management IP address of this device. Now, if it is a switch, we will have both the wired and wireless configuration options available. Those have separate management interfaces. If what we're looking at is a wireless LAN controller 5760, then you will not have the wired element. It's just going to be wireless. When you open that up, you'll put in the admin as your name and then the password that you defined in your Express setup. And then at that point, it's a matter of configuring it. Now, you can configure it manually, or if you go to the configuration dropdown, you'll see there's an option called Wizard. And so that wizard will launch you into fast, rapid initial configuration of your device. I recommend it if we're not just loading something from a config file. So what do we see here? It's a series of steps, so we'll just walk through these steps that you go through in this wizard, pretty straightforward. First, make sure that you have configured your username and password that you want for administration. Again, this gives you a chance to change it, essentially, if you want. Don't have to. Probably it should stay the same with what you've just defined unless you need to configure it differently. Then our SNMP configuration, so essentially defining the values that need to be set for SNMP, like location and contact. So if someone queries based upon SNMP, they've got the right information. Then we get to the management port and the wireless configuration. So don't confuse these two. They're very, 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 very different. The management port configuration is for the configuration of that special port in the back of the device. Let me actually give you a look at that. All right, notice what we're seeing right here is the back of a 3850. And if we look at this area down here, I want you to see that essentially we have a console port and a management port. The console port, this is if we're using the old style RJ45, the USB console ports in the front. The management port is network access. It's actually gigabit 00. So it's a specialized interface that's not a part of the normal switch interfaces. Instead, it's more like the IP interface of a router or an end user device in order to further manage it. All right, so we said that to say this, gang. Let's take a look. All right, so we can configure the IP address that's going to use. We can point to a DHCP server for a relay agent. So if I plug in a device into this management port, then the DHCP service will be whatever DHCP server we can forward to that'll then have a scope set up, a pool set up for this IP range and give the client an IP address that it can then connect to the switch in order to further manage it. Okay, so that's the management port, very specialized, basically a way to telnet or secure shell into that device, or HTTP as we're doing right now into the device, without having to set up any other form of access through IP. So a special way to manage the device offline. Then we get to the wireless management. So now we're talking about how we're really going to configure our access points to have IP addresses that work in conjunction with the wireless LAN controller. So we will have set this up to some degree when we have defined our when we did our initial configuration. You really don't want to change this VLAN because that's what you're connected to right now as you're managing it. So again, you've got the IP address that you're using, the VLAN that you're using, and the relay agent reference for a DHCP server if you're not hosting DHCP locally. Then which interfaces are you going to be using as trunk ports for switch-to-switch communication, and what are you using as access ports to connect to the access points? And so that's right there where we're configuring that capability. So for the most part, it's defining essentially which ports are the access points going to be hanging off of from this device. Next, we come to defining our RF group and our mobility group definitions. Remember, those are two separate things. So here's our RF specification, all right, our RF group, just labeled default, and our country code that we're going to use here. And then we get to mobility. The default is to be a mobility agent, but you can say, I want an all-in-one shop here. The mobility agent and mobility controller are centralized. If you do choose to leave it with mobility agent, you will need to specify the IP address of the centralized mobility controller, like a 5760 that's running multiple wireless LAN controllers in your environment that are just running the mobility agent. This is how you're going to get the correct roaming experience for all of your clients with a centralized database, layer 2 or layer 3 roaming capabilities. Again, we define our mobility group name here, and if we can define our mobility Oracle IP address, that's the top level of mobility configuration. All right, continuing, then we can build one wireless LAN. We can set up a wireless LAN. We can give it a wireless LAN ID. Notice that's a W, not a V. It is not a VLAN ID. That's a wireless LAN ID. It's just a number to keep it unique amongst all the other wireless LANs locally in its database. Here's the SSID. That's, of course, how clients will connect to it, and the profile name that's associated with access form. And so this is set up with an open access by default. Just so you know, you're configuring this, but it is disabled. So don't worry that someone's going to be connecting with open access before you're ready for anything. This is just a initial configuration that's going to be stored here. Then we get to supporting radius. You're probably going to want radius, right? ICE, if you're using that, or whatever other flavor of radius that you're using for AAA services. So we'll specify the IP address, the shared secret between you and that service, and our authentication port is 1812. Our accounting port is 1813. These are the default. If you're running at a non-default port, hey, that's why it gives you the ability to change those values. And then we get to our 802.11 configuration. Essentially, we're going to be using the 2.4 gigahertz range of B, G, and N, and or we're going to use the 5 gigahertz range of A, N, and AC. So this is going to tell the access points which radios to enable based upon support needs. Finally, we get to time configuration. Again, configuring the NTP support, if we want to enable that, and pointing to a valid NTP server that could be local in your environment, or if you want, you could even point outward to a global NTP service. Finally, it's the chance to wrap it up here with this save wizard. Are you sure you like all the settings? If so, off you go. Now, once you're done, are there any other steps that you should also keep in mind? Yes, there definitely are a couple of last-minute steps you'll want to remember. So I would also want to remember to save my configuration and back up my configuration so that I can get back to this nice kind of clean initial state if necessary. If you've configured it to be a controller, a mobility controller, you will need to reboot in order to enable support for that. You'll need to build DHCP scopes if you're locally managing DHCP, or remotely build DHCP scopes if you're remotely configuring DHCP. You'll need to enable and possibly build additional wireless LANs. Remember, the one that you built in the wizard, not actually enabled. So if you want to use it, enable it, and or build some additional ones. And then you're ready to start connecting the access points to the ports that you labeled are going to be available ports for control. Remember, the whole point of this converged access is that our access points are plugged into a port that is on the switch, which is converged to also be functioning as the CAPWAP termination point. Therefore, we're getting the best of both worlds. So this takes us to the end of our initial wizard. There's probably some more configuration we'll do for advanced settings, but this gets us up and running.